Hey there, I'm Rob Laing. I'm the CEO and founder of Farm.One, and today I'm going to answer a few questions that have been sent in to us by a bunch of different people from academia, from industry, and just fans of the site. And so I'm here with my girlfriend Gabby. She's going to ask these questions to me. We also have our dog Tyler, who you might see bobbing around here. And so, yeah, let's get started.
Great. Where do you think indoor vertical farming technology will be in the next 10 years? 50 years, 100 years?
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing a lot more people building vertical farms, whether that's doing specialty things like we're doing or doing mass market leafy greens for salad greens, that kind of thing. And so there's just more and more of this popping up. And I'm seeing this happen, in different small cities and even towns around the US. And so I think definitely there'll be more and more of this. I think the technology is getting cheaper and cheaper as well, which is great. It means it's more accessible for everyone. And so I think you're going to see, large commercial facilities still operate, but also what I'd love to see is just more entrepreneurship, more people doing this for their community. And I hope that, if you extend this out 50, 100 years, that you're just going to see a lot of creativity and also a lot more creativity about what crops people grow. As the technology gets cheaper, you'll be able to grow things like strawberries and tomatoes and fruit and other things that right now is a bit tricky to do commercially.
Indoor vertical farms are known to use fewer resources and be safer on the environment. Are there scenarios where these farms may actually do more harm than good?
Yeah, it's a question worth asking. I think that a lot of people come into vertical farming or look at it and say, hey, this is totally sustainable, there's nothing wrong with this. And what we've got to do as an industry is just be a bit more practical and say, okay, let's really look at what's going on here. In terms of water use, we're way better than traditional farming because water is contained within the system. But in terms of energy use, we use a lot of power for those lights, right? And if you're in a city or a country where access to renewable energy is limited, you are, creating fossil fuel pollution, greenhouse gas emissions through that energy consumption. And so I think people have got to be really aware of that. And so what we do as a farm is we try to buy, hey Tyler, we try to buy renewable energy where we can. And in New York, it's 100% renewables that we buy. And in every new farm that we build, we want to take the same practice or, for instance, buying solar panels to power some of that as well. And then you look at all the construction required to build a farm, right? And it's, concrete and steel and rare earth metals for the LEDs and that kind of stuff. So I think, there's no easy answer, but just assuming it's all fine and all completely sustainable isn't the way, for a good future.
Do you think the increased efficiency of indoor vertical farming is worth the increased financial cost?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think in certain commercial circumstances, it makes a lot of sense. So you're seeing bigger vertical farming companies like Bowery and Plenty and AeroFarms demonstrate value at the mass market leafy green side. And the value is for supermarkets, for consistency, safety, food safety can be radically improved versus a traditional farm. So there's real value there. But if you take something like growing potatoes, right, where it's not really a very perishable crop, it's easy to transport, it's easy to store, there's not really a lot of value being created for a vertical farm. And so I think it's really important to get very crop specific and very situation specific, where in New York, we're bringing in produce from California. Now it's much better to grow it locally. Great. In a situation where you're in California, maybe in the middle of a great growing area, maybe it's not the best thing to do.
You spoke earlier about the use of power for the farm. Where is that power for vertical farms coming from, and is it sustainable?
Yeah, so as I said, we're using renewable sources, and so in New York State, you can buy from an electricity provider who will make sure it's coming from renewable sources. Wherever it is in the world, it's going to differ. I think there's some really interesting opportunities where you could site farms close to hydroelectric power, for instance, or geothermal power in countries like Iceland or some other Scandinavian countries. So I really want to see some of those opportunities come forward.
Do you think indoor vertical farming is tackling the issues of global warming and food shortage? If so, how?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there, right? So global warming is a big question. I think that vertical farming can certainly radically reduce transport emissions for food. So instead of flying over produce from Europe to New York or from California, you can eliminate that. And we ourselves have pretty much 0 food miles, and we deliver by bike, and that's great. And also you can reduce emissions related to packaging as well. So instead of having to insulate a product very heavily and refrigerate it, you can just transport it same day and eliminate that. So that's great. Also, what we find in vertical farms, and I think that most commercial growers will experience this, is if you grow very well inside a vertical farm and you're very careful about your food safety procedures, that product can last a lot longer in the fridge as well, which means less waste. On the other hand, like there's always a trade-off, and so I think that what we've got to do as farmers, as growers, is just look at the whole picture and not make assumptions. And so that way we can be thoughtful about when we apply these technologies versus using traditional technologies, which are still great for many circumstances.
Great. Is vertical farming the best way to sustainably produce more food, or is it a good idea that should be implemented alongside things like reducing food waste?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the latter. I think, if you look at the overall food system in the US, in developed countries, there is significant food waste. It tends to be less now at the agricultural end of the spectrum. In the West, we have pretty good food storage. We have pretty good food transport. For instance, if you buy strawberries, you can be pretty sure that temperature of that pallet has stayed pretty consistent throughout the supply chain. Whereas towards the end, we have a lot of food waste. Consumers, we throw out a lot of food. We let spinach go wilted in the back of the fridge. We don't tend to, use the leftovers we always should. So I think that we've got to look at everything as a suite of things that everyone has to improve on. And I think vertical farming kind of just fits into one part of that, right? As I said, like it can dramatically improve food lifetime in storage. And so you can have that salad green sitting there for sometimes like 10 days or even 2 weeks in the fridge. And actually, if it's being grown in a very controlled environment, it might still be fine. But yeah, it's not going to solve everything, right? And I think that historically, we've been pretty obsessed with getting enough calories to enough people. 50 years ago, everyone was worried about population explosion and how we're going to feed everybody. But now really, we have sufficient calories in the US. We just don't have the right calories. And so we have people who live in food deserts where they can get processed food really easily, but they can't get fresh food, or it's not affordable, right? And so vertical farming, I think, can go some way to solving that, because we can have more food grown in our communities. It can be grown, in the cities or in harsh climates. And so getting the right calories, I think, is one of the things that vertical farming can do.
In the next 50 years, do you think the combined productivity of all indoor vertical farms, in the next 50 years, do you think the combined productivity of all indoor vertical farming companies will be suitable for growing the majority of the world's vegetable needs?
I doubt that we're going to get to a point where we're growing the majority of vegetables in vertical farms. I'd like to think that we can still use a lot of the great land out there that we have and the sunlight that we have. And so I think that you might find that there's a lot more situations where vertical farming is used, but I'm definitely not of the opinion that we need to get rid of outdoor agriculture, and so yeah, I think it's part of the solution, but let's not try to make it the solution to everything.
If the majority of our produce were to be grown by indoor vertical farms, how do you think our agricultural supply chain would be distributed?
Yeah, I think, there's an interesting part to that question, right? Which is about, well, how does agriculture work? And if the majority of us are living in cities, that's the way it's going, and in a lot of countries that's the way it already is, then, this relationship of like farm far away, city, bringing stuff in, no connection to food, there's some real problems with that, right? And so what I love about vertical farming is that you can have farms close to where people live, which of course reduces food miles, but also increases our connection to the farm, right? We get to understand where our ingredients come from. We also socially, we would be more likely to know the farmer or know the people who are working on the farm, right? So if I buy right now avocados from Mexico, it may well be that the workers there are in really great conditions, but it may not be, right? And they may not be paid sufficiently, and they may be, undergoing labor practices which we wouldn't support here in New York State, right? Whereas, if you can move more farming closer to the community, then you can be sure, okay, these people are paid well, these people have paid sick leave, these people, are part of our community and we can support them. And that's, one of the, I think, long-term more powerful things about it. And that connection to food that we've kind of lost in the US, that could start to come back. And I love seeing that when we bring kids to the farm and they can see stuff growing for the first time and they can pick a leaf and they can taste it and they know that it's real, and all that kind of interaction, starts to be possible again, which I love. Tyler's falling asleep. Yeah.
Has your company faced any issues with upscaling your indoor vertical farming technology?
I think that question for us might be, a tricky one to answer. We've sort of, at every stage we've built new farms or farm equipment, we always sort of iterate on what happened before. And the nice thing about building at relatively small scale is you can do that relatively quickly. We don't need to spend $40 million to try out a new idea. So yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that there are some things where, the first engineering solution isn't necessarily the best one, and so we try to make it better. But we certainly don't have an experience as a company of building something that's like 100,000 square feet or something like that. And certainly companies now are trying some of those things out, and they're experiencing things and learning.
There are various indoor vertical farming methods: hydroponics, aeroponics, aquaponics. You get the drift. Which did your company choose and why?
So we use primarily hydroponics, which really means that we're using a water-based solution instead of soil, but we're not really doing anything like spraying that solution or fogging it or doing anything like that. So it's generally sort of flowing or basically still, that water. Whereas in aeroponics, you might be misting, or you might be sort of almost like spraying it onto the plant's roots. Aquaponics, on the other hand, would be using fish or sea life to create nutrients in that water, which the plants would then uptake, with the idea of ideally a sort of closed loop. We don't do aquaponics. I think, partly it's a sort of philosophical thing for me. I don't really want to have to involve other creatures like fish in our agriculture. Also commercially, it's been really difficult to demonstrate that on a commercial scale that can work without significant difficulty. And then in terms of aeroponics, no particular reason why we don't use it, but we found some practices with hydroponics that work really well, that are relatively low maintenance, and so we've gone that way. But certainly there's some companies doing great stuff in all three categories.
What has been the largest challenge your company has faced with indoor vertical farming?
Oh boy. I mean, we're a startup, so like every day is a challenge. I think that, at the very beginning, one of the things we really focused on at the very beginning was, I had seen before I started, I'd looked at a lot of vertical farming startups, and I had seen a lot of people get some of the engineering right, but really not figure out the marketing. And so building farms without figuring out who they were going to sell to or how they were going to distribute. And so for me, that was really our number one focus. And so once we could figure out how to connect with chefs and deliver within the city, that was a great sort of accomplishment for us. I think that, as we went from really, really small to like a little bit bigger, one of the realities we faced was, pest control at a very, very small scale is really easy. And then when you get to a little bit bigger, you got to get really serious about it. So that was a huge learning experience for us. And in addition to that, I think, throughout this process, farming, it's tough. It's, we're in a high margin part of the farming business, but it's still a relatively low margin business. And so when you're operating, there's not a lot of cash flow kind of coming in. So as a company, you got to be really lean. You got to be really agile to make sure that you're not just, throwing too much money after R&D and not, actually recouping it, in terms of operational profit. And that's, I think, going to be a struggle for all of the vertical farming companies out there. Farming is just a tough business, you know. So if you get into this, you kind of have to you have to love it, you know, and you have to really, you know, be pretty controlled about your finances.
What do you think are the limiting factors preventing the indoor vertical farming industry from growing even more rapidly?
Well, I think that, you know, over the past 5 years, there's been significant investment from VCs, which, you know, is a great way to get an industry going. You know, there's been hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars going into some of these companies. I think that, you know, we're entering a really difficult financial climate right now. You know, some of those sources of like big checks, you know, they're going to dry up. And I think some of these companies are going to have to prove that they have like a chance of profitability before people are going to throw more money at them. So I think that's just a financial situation difficulty there. I think that, you know, the other thing that's happening is obviously the price point of leafy greens and the cost to operate these farms. You know, I don't see that cost of operation going down as rapidly as probably it needs to. And so I think there needs to be some real innovation that is helping these companies automate, that's helping, you know, just reduce the cost of the capex of building these farms. And until that happens, it's going to be, you know, pretty tricky for people to find a way out of that.
You speak of these innovations that farming companies are going to have to find. Many indoor vertical farming companies collect data on their plants. Does your company do this? If so, is it beneficial? And what has it been useful for?
Yeah, so, you know, in any, I think, modern company, you're going to collect data, right? It's just a kind of given. And so, you know, the question really becomes, okay, what am I trying to focus on? What am I trying to learn? And, you know, how detailed do I need to get in order to learn it? And so, you know, for a small company like ours, like we can collect data on, like, you know, the harvest process, for instance. Does it take longer to harvest this crop versus that? What are the specific activities that people are doing that take time, for instance? And for us, that's probably more important than like measuring each plant and figuring out, is this plant like got slightly more calcium than this one, you know? The other thing that we're doing is we're growing a lot of different plants, right? So we're trying to really establish growing recipes for each one of those plants. So data for us is about that feedback loop of like, okay, we plant this seed, where does it get to in this length of time? Is it harvestable here? What's the leaf size? And so getting specific about those crops and how they grow in our system. Whereas, you know, if we were a different kind of company growing one or two kinds of crops, we'd be much more about optimization of that one variety and looking for variation within the growing area, that kind of stuff. I think one of the, you know, sort of pet peeves I have is companies talking about how many data points they've collected or something like that. So they have a farm full of 1,000 plants. Okay, sure, you've got 1,000 different data points. But really, you know, if you look out at the growing bed of spinach or arugula or basil, you can see, like, okay, all these guys are pretty much healthy. You're not really getting a lot more insight from that data. And so for us, like, you know, getting insight versus getting more data, you know, that's the key thing, because insight allows me to make a decision or for us to adjust, you know, climate controls, that kind of thing. That's where companies really need to focus.
Do you have any wishes for your indoor farm in the future?
Oh, well, you know, for us, it's a quite specific vision, which is that, you know, we love the idea of having more and more Farm.Ones everywhere. And this goes back to, you know, my hope about community and farming coming together. The more farms we have, the more close we can be to people. And we want to build farms that are close enough we don't have to ship our product. I don't really want to have like the biggest farm in the world shipping this stuff all over everywhere. I want to have small farms in cities that can be close to community. The other side of that is obviously the experience of visiting our farms, where people can have a tour, they can have a class, they can learn. You know, that kind of stuff is just as important as selling the product to chefs or consumers.
Do you use artificial intelligence in your indoor farm? If not, why don't you?
You know, I would say we use very simple forms of artificial intelligence in our software. You know, so our software like defines, okay, what do we do today? What should we do next week? Do we need to reorder these supplies? That kind of thing. In terms of, the phrase artificial intelligence, certainly we do not have like some crazy algorithms going along crunching millions of data points, deciding what to do. But I also suspect that, most people in the indoor farming world don't really have a lot of very complex AI either. So I think we got to be really careful about that term. It's like very buzzwordy, and most of the time when you look under the hood, it's just a lot of like conditional statements like if this, then that. And that's fine. That kind of tech is fine, but I think calling it AI sometimes is really just dressing it up.
Are there any plans to extend the varieties of food on your farm?
Yeah, I mean, we do that, through two ways, I guess. Specifically within the world of microgreens, rare herbs, edible flowers, we're always looking for stuff. So if there's a new variety of cucumber flower that we can grow, like we're going to go after that seed and we're going to find it. I think the other thing is, okay, should we start growing more food type items, like fruiting vegetables like tomatoes and zucchini and that kind of stuff. And we're always trying little things out there. The harsh commercial reality for us is unless something's going to make us as much money as this stuff or more, we're not going to grow it. And there's plenty of demand for the things that we do grow. So, we're always doing R&D, but is it likely that we come out with cucumbers like anytime soon? Like, no, I would say.
Okay, and last question. How do you feel about your dog stealing the show?
Aw, he's the best. He's
the
just
best.
having a good time. I think it's the best time in the past 50 years for dogs.
Yeah.
Spending a lot of time with us, having a lot of cuddles. So, yeah, I'm okay with it.
Is Tyler going to be employed on the farm? Do you see a future for dogs and vertical farming to come together?
I think there's a fundamental problem in that dogs are kind of dirty animals and bringing them into a clean space is problematic. So I think his job is more on the marketing side and, consumer engagement in online, that kind of thing. I think that's where his future is. But, in terms of farming and harvesting, I don't think he's got a future.